us Brits take too much lying down? To discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome the leader of the Heritage Party, David Curtin, and former UKIP MEP, Godfrey Bloom. We'll start with you, David Curtin. Do you think the Brits are too compliant?
I think on this issue with pensions, I don't think it's something that people see as imminent and is going to make an imminent, immediate detrimental effect to their finances. Whereas, in France, I think it is. The pensions are going up from 62 to 64. I don't know over what time frame. Here in the UK, they're going up. They went up a couple of years ago. They're going up again later this decade. But people seem to be resigned to this. But when you do have things that have an imminent, immediate effect, then people do go out on the streets in this country and they do protest. I mean, there were the poll tax riots we know about in 1990. There were the energy price protests in 2000. I think also another example of where people went out on the streets is what I was involved in over the last 3 years in protesting for freedom, the freedom rallies against lockdowns and so on, and against vaccine mandates. There were hundreds of thousands of people month after month after month in London and around the country going out to protest about that, but they were largely peaceful, except when the riot police went in and attacked the protesters. And that's what we're seeing in France. I think actually the vast majority of the people who are protesting about pensions, which is a real issue to the French people, you're seeing the violence there, not from the people, but from the riot police are going in, and they are really being very, very aggressive and doing things that should not be happening in a Western democracy.
Indeed. Godfrey Bloom, what's your reaction to what's happening in France and parallels with how the British respond to unpopular policies?
Well, David, of course, is right. He's mentioned the poll tax riots. You could also mention the Liverpool riots, the Moss Side riots. And, of course, if it is violent, here's the sad thing. If it's violent, when the Liverpool riots happened, Michael Heseltine rushed up there with his checkbook as soon as his little legs could carry him. And when the poll tax riots took place, they were violent and poll tax was abandoned. And now there are it seems there could be 9 million people taking to the streets all over France, not just Paris, incidentally. Now, this is rather amusing, actually. I had a little chuckle about this earlier. I wonder who explained to King Charles that he couldn't go because there were millions of people on the streets protesting. Because he would have said, no, surely not. I watch the BBC regularly, and it can't be so because none of this has been reported. And so I wonder who broke that news to him, poor little fellow, who lives in a bubble of sycophants round him, watching only the BBC. And so consequently, he will be sitting at home now rather bewildered. So I think perhaps you might refer to Rudyard Kipling's wonderful poem, Beware the Anglo-Saxon. We are slow to take off. We're very slow for violence. We don't like that sort of thing in this country, and that's probably because nobody's invaded us for 1,000 years until, I suppose, possibly recently Dover. And so we tend to be a little bit complacent. We are a complacent nation, and I think that's the problem. I also it might be interested in this, David and Mark, yourselves. I decided, because I couldn't understand a lot of this, I did a Smithsonian psychology course over the winter. Long distance, one of these courses, to try and work out why people think as they do. And Mark, you just spoke to people on the sofa there who simply refuse to join the dots. All the evidence is there now. Everything is there that you need statistically. The data is out, but they're still sticking to this ludicrous idea that it was all, broadly speaking, a good idea and there was nothing to do. They couldn't do anything about it. They're also suggesting it was a one-off. It was a first, which is ridiculous because I was around in 1968 when there was a much bigger flu crisis with more deaths, and it was much worse. So, yes, we had lived through it before, and we handled it just like the Swedes handled it this time round, and it was better. So we have a nation that doesn't join the dots. And in my Smithsonian course that I did, apparently they say, and it's probably a Western European thing, or it could be a global thing, I don't know, that 80% of the people will swallow just about everything that the authority tells them to do. That, they just will swallow all that. And they were sort of the sort of people sitting on your bench earlier. They will believe anything the government says if it's delivered with a straight face. And this is the problem that we have. 20% of people don't. I took no notice of the lockdown. I didn't have the jabs. I never wore a mask. And I built a pub on the back of my small holding right the way through all the lockdowns. And the whole village came and we got pissed. And that's the way we handled it, because I'm one of the 20% who doesn't let people tell me what to do.
Fair enough. Now, of course, I have a responsibility as a national broadcaster to say that we must uphold the rule of law. You don't break the law, because that's the great thing about this country. But David, how do you respond to what Godfrey has just said there about the Brits being too compliant?
Well, I think Godfrey is right, actually. I mean, I think we were far too compliant through the lockdown period in particular, and people went along with laws which were repugnant to our constitution and to our fundamental freedoms. You know, we have the fundamental freedoms to have the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to protest. And I think there is a place for civil disobedience when a government starts to act in a tyrannical manner. We don't want to live in an Orwellian society, and that's what started to be brought in at the beginning of lockdown, and then later on with the vaccine passports and no jab, no job rules, where we know care home workers were put out of a job, and then they tried to get nurses and doctors in the NHS put out of a job as well, just for exercising their right not to be injected with an experimental injection of mRNA. And if that is what the government's doing, then, you know, actually we have a duty to freedom. We have a duty to ourselves and to the generations coming after us to protest against the government. But the government says you're not allowed to protest. You're not allowed to assemble. They actually made it illegal to gather in groups of more than 6 at some point, and sometimes even more than 2 people. I nearly got a £200 fine for talking to 2 other people in Richmond Park in February 2021. I remember it well. And I didn't in the end. And most of these fines that were given out were squashed by the courts, because they realized that they were just repugnant to every standard and common law that exists. But we do have a duty sometimes to engage in civil disobedience when these kind of things happen. And we do have a tradition of that in this country. And as Godfrey says, we don't get to that place quickly. But when people realize that something needs to be done to uphold and maintain our way of life and our freedoms and the values that our nation is built on, then it's right to do that thing. I absolutely think it is right to protest in that way.